back for chapter 5. I hope everyone's doing all right out there today and looking forward to the next chapter. Maybe. We'll see. Let's get started. Chapter 5, Love and Lovecraft. The nearest building was the rectory of the Church of St. Dismas, and in a little niche beside the dwelling's entrance, a small brass lamp burned a tiny flame all day and night. We fled over the bridge and towards this flicker of warmth and civilization, hurdling the graves in our hurry to the rectory door and the succor we might find within. Traditions can be such ridiculous things. Those of sentimental disposition may defend them, but I suspect the main function of a tradition is to promote thoughtless action, and more often than not they provide us with the excuse of mindlessly plodding through our day without regard. I'm sure if I were to ask every single inhabitant in Dunham County why the Church of St. Dismas kept an oil lamp burning next to the rear door, none would be able to provide me with an honest answer. Surely there would be a great deal of speculation and conjecture, but before the conversation concluded, they'd fall back to the excuse of tradition. It has always been done thusly, and so we will continue to do it so until the stars burn out and the universe goes dark. Certainly I'd never questioned the tradition of the oil lamp before we found ourselves dashing headlong towards the rectory door, our hands clasped tightly. The low clouds and cool rain had darkened the day, but that tiny speck of light became a beacon of encouragement in a time of distress, and we hurried towards it and pounded heavily upon the wooden door. Never had I been so happy for such a cheerful spark to guide us. The door creaked open. There stood Father Noonan. He was an educated man of 30 or 35, with a graceful disposition and an aristocratic, there you go. I wrote it, I should be able to say it right. With a graceful disposition and an aristocratic air that had been somewhat stifled by the restrictions placed upon him by his profession. I think, given leave to follow a secular path, Noonan might have been a rascal and an explorer, but the steady nature of his career had given him an uncontestable path to follow, and that left him with a charitable character, unfettered by the weight of uncertainty or the hunger of ambitions. Years ago, during one of our conversations, I had brushed my hand against his wrist and caught a snippet of his inner state, and I'd found him to be a complex yet deeply contented individual who consciously and willingly poured his considerable intelligence into his faith. Father Noonan was a very stable, very thoughtful person, and I liked him a great deal, even if we did not always agree on matters of religion. He had cropped dark hair, expressive brown eyes, and a full set of straight, even teeth that produced a memorable smile. My mother often lamented at the cruelty of fate, that the most handsome man in all the county should be bound to a life of servitude and unwavering abstinence. "Good evening, ladies. What can I—" He noticed our pallid faces, and his expression shifted from one of politeness to genuine concern and astonishment. "Goodness, what is the matter?" "In the woods," Jane panted, pointing back across the field. Come in, he urged, and stepped back to give us entrance. Wet and bedraggled, Jane and I stumbled into the rectory of St. Dismas, and my heart only began to slow when I heard the bolt slide shut with a bang. He ushered us into the kitchen and invited us to sit at the small table, where a single setting of potatoes and lamb hash had been set. Father Noonan poured out 3 small cups of red wine and set one each before Jane and me before taking his own. "Now take ease, ladies, and catch your breath," he said kindly, "and when you're ready, tell me what's happened." Jane took up the tale. I was still too winded. "There was a creature in the woods, a snake, I think, as big as a dragon." To his credit, Father Noonan did not tell us we were wrong, but he certainly balked at telling us that we were right. "A snake, are you certain?" "Something very large," I panted. "How large?" Jane held out her hands as far as they could spread. "As big as a tiger." "Good Lord," he exclaimed. "We saw it quite clearly," Jane assured him. "I know what I saw." "Are there snakes of such size on Dreadmore Heath?" he inquired. "It would need plenty of food, which of course the heath could provide, but I can't see how it could have escaped anyone's notice long enough to reach such proportions." I finally wrestled my breath into a manageable rhythm. "Mr. Darling said no animals are left on Dreadmore," I said. "Perhaps the snake has eaten up every scrap of life." Father Noonan furrowed his brow at this piece of information. "So a worm of monstrous size has infested our safe haven. If true, you're fortunate to have escaped it." He stood quickly and grabbed for his cloak, which hung on a hook by the door. I'll head directly to the mayor and put forth a warning and send out men to capture it and kill it immediately. Jane seized upon this idea. You must! No one is safe with it lurking in the trees. Please, stay here, ladies, he invited. Once the village has been warned, I'll accompany you home myself. Father Noonan, abandoning his dinner, rushed out into the spring rain, leaving Jane and I alone in the drab, antiquated kitchen. We heard him in the yard harnessing his spotted pony to the little trap. Then the vehicle rattled out to the road at top speed. Once he was gone, Jane said, How lucky we are that Father Noonan was here. But I, with my breath now easy in my chest and the wine warming my belly, had begun to suffer second thoughts. They'll never believe us, I said. There's no wild creature larger than a badger in all of Dunham County. That was no badger, she replied. My hands had turned quite cold, so I stood and stoked the fire in the kitchen until it roared. But what could it have been? An anaconda, she replied. Isn't that the fabled serpent of Amazonia? What if we're being overrun with anacondas? Jane, that's ridiculous, I said. You saw it just as I did. Green and brown. Isn't that the color of an anaconda? Or is it a boa? I get them mixed up. My sister had settled her opinion and would not let it go. Be reasonable, I urged as I returned to the table, and a fresh burst of rain splattered across the window. I can't explain what I saw, but that doesn't give me liberty to leap to conclusions. She took a sip of tea. But you agree it was a snake? I do, but one snake does not make an infestation, and there's no evidence that it came from far overseas. I'd say it's more likely to be a fat garter snake of our boring garden variety than some far-flung dragon. Jane held out her hands, encircling her fingers. That was the circumference of the beast I saw, Harry. Huge. Oh, the poor thing is just pudgy, I said, over the rim of my glass. Between the good wine, the warm fire, and my conjecture, her terror was melting into good humor. Do snakes even get fat? She asked. Apparently so, I replied. That one in the veil is positively tubby. Oh, Harry, she said with a laugh, you're being ridiculous. I was, but it was worth it to see her relax. Don't worry, Jane. The veil isn't large, and I'm sure the mayor will be happy enough for an excuse to go hunting, I replied. They'll have found the poor thing and dispatched it by the end of the day, and then they'll parade it around town, and we'll be absolutely embarrassed by how small it is, because our fear has made it 3 times larger than it is in reality. I took another sip of wine. Out of all of this, we get to enjoy a ride home with Father Noonan, so that's a pleasant end to the afternoon. Plus we'll have a good story to share with Mary and Emma. And won't they be envious that we were invited to the Darlings' house and enjoyed such an adventure, she replied with a chuckle. Halfway between the village and home, the squall broke and the clouds began to clear, and when the pony and trap clattered down our driveway, Mamma hurried out in a flap of skirts and shawls to see what was the matter. When Father Noonan disembarked and held out one hand to assist Jane, Mamma launched into scolding us for bothering the priest. You have good strong legs, she snapped at us, slapping my thigh. Could you not walk? Did you have to pester the father until he'd give you a ride home? He must, you know. He must be charitable. It's his duty. He can't say no if you ask. I was not harangued, he laughed. The ladies encountered a creature in the woods and were pursued by it to Church Bridge, so they came to my door seeking help. I would never turn away someone in peril. Why, for that very reason, the lamp of St. Dismas is always lit. Pursued? Pursued? Goodness, by what? A badger? Oh, dear girls. Oh, come in, my mother fawned. Oh, you kind and sweet man, how good it was that you were there to lend a hand. Do stay for dinner. We would be happy to have you join us at the table. Beatrice, set another place for the father. She ushered him into the front hall. Mr. Lovecraft will be ever so happy to have you join us. He enjoys your conversations. He tries to engage me in spiritual topics, but I tell him that religious nonsense only clutters up one's thoughts, and he does not listen to my good sense, father, but insists on discussing such fanciful things with the girls, doesn't he, Harry? From time to time, yes, I said. We'd come through the hall and into the afternoon parlor, and she offered Father Noonan a seat by the hearth. I'm happy to take the burden of such a conversation from you, madam, he replied with a charming smile. I have other more pressing concerns, she replied. Running a house takes all my mental facilities, you understand. A woman in my position simply has no time for philosophies and spirits. Beatrice, have you set a place for the father? Did you hear me from the yard? Then, back to the father, she said, Very good of you to bring Jane and Harriet home. As I said, the ladies were chaste, he replied. They were in a sorry state when I opened the door. "Oh, girls," said my mother with disapproval, "what has taken your fancy now?" Then back to Father Noonan, she said, "Harry reads too much. Her imagination is too lively, and it has no outlet." "We saw something in the trees, Mamma," Jane began, and as Papa arrived from his study, she turned to him. "It was a serpent of gigantic proportions. Father Noonan has informed the mayor." "And he sent his sons into the vale to look for any trace," the priest said. "I'm sure it will be dispatched by morning." Papa, who rarely rose to any emotional pitch, gave a sedate nod. "That's very good to hear," he replied. "I see no need to worry, then, if the Chowder boys are on the trail. I was about to make my rounds of the apiaries, which I do every night before dinner. Would you like to join me, Father?" So the men went into the garden, and Mamma rounded on us. "Well?" "We think it was a snake," I began, but found myself abruptly cut off. "Not your wee beastie in the woods, Harry," she dismissed. "I want to know about the darlings." Mamma yearned for every particular about our visit, and she would not let us go until she'd wrung every nuance and innuendo out of us. How were the brothers dressed? Did they incline their heads when Jane spoke? What topics did we discuss? Did they eat heartily or sparingly? On and on came her questions, as unrelenting as the river current. Jane would commit her allegiance to neither gentleman, yet she remained polite and pleasant, and when at last she was able to slip from Mamma's grasp to head out to the Huntsman's Oak, she did so with a palpable air of relief. Once my younger sister had fled for the freedom of the outdoors, the full force of my mother's interrogation fell upon me. "Well," said Mamma, "well?" "It was a fine luncheon," I said. "Conversation was pleasant enough." She reached out to pinch my cheek. "I'm very happy you accompanied her, Harriet," Mamma said. "With such an important choice laid out before Jane, I take comfort that you're on hand to talk sense into her. She looks up to you and values your opinion very highly." She paused, obviously waiting for some tidbit of information, and when it was not forthcoming, she prompted me with a flutter of her hands. "Well, what do you think between the two of them?" "Which would I prefer?" "No, silly duck," she replied with a trill of a laugh. "Which man is better suited to Jane?" Then, waggling her fingers, she said, "There's no hope of marriage for you, I'm afraid, so we must do everything we can to support Jane in her search for a match." I glanced out the window to my three sisters, strolling through the gardens towards the driveway and the Huntsman's Oak, and beyond them my father and the father examining the beehives. "Well, I suppose I like George best," I said. "He seems more humble, though he does not suffer from an excess of wit. Certainly he is more generous in sharing his opinions, and he does not allow a lack of education on a subject to silence him." "Oh, Harry," Mamma sighed, and when I turned from the window to look at her, I noticed tears glimmering in her eyes. "What's wrong?" She dabbed at her face with her handkerchief. "Oh, my steadfast Harry, ever since Casilda's visit, I feel as I have failed you." "Failed me?" I said, as she took her seat by the fireplace. "In what way?" Mamma took another deep sigh. "I've always known you are the plainest of our children, and I should have helped you more. Jane is a beauty, and Mary is robust. Even Emma, with her delicate features, will find it easy to attract a gentleman to care for her and protect her. All three have something to set them apart. But you, I'm afraid, you have no discerning characteristics to attract a man, and thus will be left alone in your twilight years." One might think I'd be insulted by such a blunt assessment of my mousy brown hair, grey eyes, unremarkable features, and solitary nature. But I've known my mother my whole life. She means well. "It's not all bad, Mamma," I replied. "I have my novels to keep me company. I may yet find someone who shares my love of reading." But would they want you at your advanced age?" she said. "And would you want them if no one has yet claimed them? What if they're working class? Or worse yet, an actor? Oh, oh!" She pressed the kerchief to her mouth to suppress a sob, and once she dabbed the fresh tears leaking from her eyes, she added, "I should have tried harder to find you a suitable fellow. I should have petitioned more on your behalf, or told a few fibs to increase your talents. Maybe if I'd said you were a better beekeeper, or that you make the best cakes in all the county." With that, she began to cry. "There's no need to resort to lies, Mamma," I said. "You've not wronged me in any way. You aren't angry?" "Honestly, my mother." I pressed a quick kiss to the crown of her grey head, and felt the sting of her grief and disappointment through my lips. "Not in the least. I may be unremarkable in all aspects, Mamma, but I like who I am, and I'd rather be pleased with myself and live alone than have all the men in the world chase after me while my heart is full of self-loathing. A clatter of dishes in the kitchen caught her ear and distracted her. Oh, goodness, Beatrice! Beatrice, have you set another plate? Did you hear me before? I'm sure, if there is a God, even he flinched at the shrill tone of my mother's demands. The glass vase on the mantel shivered, the wires of the piano hummed, the cat in the corner fled for the door. If Beatrice hadn't heard, it's because my mother's voice had already rendered her deaf. But with the force of her emotions now focused on poor Beatrice, I was satisfied that she'd collected herself. I joined the other three at the Huntsman's Oak, rolling my eyes as I reached them. Mary was the first to speak. Mamma is in a bit of a state, we heard the wailing. You know how emotional she can be, especially in matters of matrimony, I replied. But honestly, the topic of which darling makes a better husband is the least of my concerns at the moment. Did Jane tell you of our chase through the woods? Emma nodded rapidly, like a bird. And Jane says it was an anaconda? I took a breath to speak, but Mary spoke before I could agree. That's ridiculous, she determined. We're half a world away from Amazonia. Jane looked at me. They don't believe me. They think I've gone mad. No, I don't think you're mad, Mary replied with a measure of frustration. I only think you're mistaken. You might have seen, I don't know, a hedgehog. It was no hedgehog, slithering through the trees and painted to look like tree bark, I said. And when she began to protest, I added, or, if it was, then I deem it to be the most remarkable hedgehog to ever live, and well worth studying further. I took a seat on the low branch and said more to myself than to my sisters, I think we should go into the vale ourselves, to the very spot we saw it, and pick up its trail. This earned a stern refusal from both Emma and Mary, and a gasp from Jane. No, Harry, I will not go back into those woods, not before the men have rooted it out. We'd be perfectly safe as long as we're together, I insisted. Nothing would dare attack us. The Chowder boys have probably found it already, Mary assured. And even if they haven't, Jane continued, the rain will have washed away any tracks, and the sun is going down. Maybe in the full light of morning we could hope to be successful, but at this hour we'd be courting danger. We could easily trip and fall in the dark woods and leave one of us nursing a broken leg. Emma shook her head, and that would be far beyond my quirk to remedy. Jane took up my hand in hers. Tomorrow, Harry. We'll all go tomorrow, once the sun is up and the forest is safe. The terror she'd felt had mellowed into a nervous ache, all bound together with anxiety and timidity. I felt my resolve faltering. Then, startled, I slipped my hand out of hers. Jane! I'm sorry, she said, and she looked remorseful but resigned, as if to say the use of her quirk couldn't be helped. I know it's rude to influence another, but you've got that stubborn look in your eye, and when you get like this, nothing dissuades you. And you can't think it's a good idea to put yourself in danger again. I only wanted you to come to the decision on your own. I was frustrated, but of course she was right. Maybe it was the lingering sensation of her touch, or maybe I was coming to my senses of my own accord. But the light was failing, and night was coming, and I'd be an idiot to think we could find any tracks in the darkness. In the morning, then, I said, as Beatrice appeared in the yard to call us to dinner. But in the morning, instead of waking by the crowing of the rooster or the calling of the crows, I was wrenched from my dreams by the piercing tea kettle squeal of my mother coming from the direction of the back door. The windows trembled as the door slammed. I hurried downstairs in my nightgown, expecting bedlam, with Emma close at my heels. Mamma met me at the bottom of the stairwell. Do you know anything about this, Harriet? She said sharply, and brandished a basket in my direction. Inside was my brown shawl, neatly folded. I blinked twice. Sleep muddled my thoughts. It took a moment for my addled brain to recognize it. Mr. Blackwood has returned the basket, I said. She did not look pleased. Well, I certainly don't know who has returned it, child. I found it by the frog pond, along with this. Tucked under the shawl was a letter in an envelope, addressed to the brown-haired one. That must be you, Mamma said. No one else in his house lays claim to such a plain and forgettable identity. I took the envelope and flipped it over in my hands. Emma was at my elbow in a thrall. The envelope had been folded from simple cream-colored paper, hot-pressed and elegant, and when I opened the flap, I found the letter written on the same stock. In an artistic hand, it read, Thank you. So is it from Mr. Blackwood? said my mother, hungry for information. It must be, I replied, although why he'd choose to communicate through the written word and not stay to knock on the door and speak directly with me is a mystery. Perhaps you intimidate him, said Emma. At that my mother erupted in gales of laughter. I took the letter and went out to the garden, and Emma followed me. Both of us stood there in our nightgowns, surrounded by the blush of fresh lavender bushes, and she watched as I ran my fingertips over its surface, eyes closed, to listen to the faint impressions upon it. What does it tell you, Harry? It's been out of doors for a few hours. I can feel there is... I closed my eyes. Well, there's a sense of gratitude, but we don't need my quirk to know that, only the ability to read. I smiled. But there's hesitation, too, uncertainty. I was right. He might be shy, said Emma. Yes, I think so, I said. I opened my eyes, and she took the letter to examine it herself. And there's a sense of urgency, of gobbling. Like a turkey? No, I laughed, like a wolf. I guess he must be very hungry, for I left him enough cheese and bread to last the week, but I think he may have devoured it in one sitting. She peeked at me over the edge of the letter. You can tell that from one little slip of paper? The impressions are fading from the item, but yes. Emma gave a little grunt. Well, I wish I had such a useful quirk. All I can do is make people feel a little better when they're ill. What do you think I should do? Why do anything, Emma answered. You've reached out to him, and he's been polite in returning the basket and acknowledging your generosity. The poor man wants nothing to do with us, so I say we oblige him. I took the letter back. He's shy, but that doesn't mean he wants to be alone, I said. Mary and Jane hurried out of the house, both neatly dressed. I supposed in an emergency they wished to look presentable. When I displayed the letter, Mary scowled and took it in hand. I've been awake and sewing since sunup, she said in her gruff manner. No one came by way of the road, or I would have seen them. He might have come across the fields, Emma pointed out, or maybe he visited under the cover of night. You'd think he might have snooped around the house in the night, said Jane, scandalized. After our encounter with the serpent, she seemed particularly on edge, and she took the letter from Mary to examine it more closely. I don't like the thought of some strange man skulking through our yard. Emma leaned forwards. Do you think, instead of a snake, it was Mr. Blackwood following you in the woods? I am certain it was not, I said, and Jane laughed. Not unless he was swinging through the trees like an ape. We haven't seen the man yet, Mary pointed out. Maybe he is an ape. I suspect he may be invisible, Jane replied. He's an invisible ape, I said. With fine handwriting, if this is to be judged, said Mary. Jane held the letter at arm's length to admire it. To be sure, a very talented and artistic invisible ape. I think I like this Mr. Blackwood more and more. Emma frowned. Are you teasing me? She said. You're all being very silly now. Oh, Emma, I'm sure Mr. Blackwood means us no harm, Jane began with a laugh, but we shall all go in the morning, the four of us, to see if we can spot the beast in the trees. She pinched Emma's cheek. And you must bring your little camera obscura with you and show us all how it works. But a movement on the road caught Mary's eye, and she said, Look, here comes Mrs. Runkle. In a great hurry, Emma said. Maybe the Chowder boys found our tubby garter snake, I said to Jane, and she laughed again. We four, 2 in dress and 2 in nightgowns, headed to the front of the house to greet her, and by the time we reached our front door, she was hustling down our drive past the huntsman's oak. Her hat was askew, and her shawl fluttered around her like the wings of a chicken. Her knees wobbled, her frail hands trembled, and her glasses had slid to the bottom of her button nose. It was rare to see Mrs. Runkle away from her beloved postal counter, and even rarer still to see her so far removed from the center of the village, for Lovecraft Cottage was no small distance to cover, and she was hardly athletic. But still there must have been a fount of strength in her core. After all, she was grandmother and guardian to Marvell Runkle, a young man of questionable character and intellect, and how such a fragile woman managed to wrangle that spirited half-wit, I'll never know. I raised my hand to greet her, but my smile vanished when I saw her distress. Girls, she said, where is your father? We ushered her into the house and set her in the morning parlor on the couch of a window square of sunshine. Emma fetched her a drink of lemonade, and Mamma bustled in from the kitchen alerted by our voices. What is it, Mrs. Runkle? She said as she came through the hall. Goodness, Edith, you look stricken. Did they find the snake? Said Mary, but the old woman shook her head. The rabbit child, the troublesome one, you know, said Mrs. Runkle, still panting. She took the lemonade from Emma and swallowed it down in 3 desperate gulps. Her hands quivered, her lungs heaved. Jane looked to me quickly, then sat alongside Mrs. Runkle and took her hand. "Be calm," she said, stroking the gnarled fingers. "All will be well. Be calm, Mrs. Runkle." A drowsy look dropped over the woman's face, and her breath slowed. Mamma was not pleased by such a blatant use of a quirk, but instead of chastising Jane, she sat in her chair across from Mrs. Runkle and said, "Do you mean Earl Rabbit, Edith?" Yes, that's the one," Mrs. Runkle said softly. "When his mother rose to build the fires in the bakery ovens, he was missing from his bed, and the lad is nowhere to be found. His shoes are in the corridor, his coat's on the hook, but Earl has vanished completely. Worst of all, the latch has been snapped from the window as if a great force pulled it open. Of course Mrs. Rabbit is in a state, as you can imagine." Old Mrs. Runkle's voice adopted a little more fire, as if she was waking from a stupor. "She's certain that Earl has been ripped from his bed against his will, and Mr. Rabbit is assembling a search party and has asked Mayor Chowder to put out a formal request for assistance. I was asked to fetch Mr. Lovecraft and ask if he will join the search." "We all know Earl is troublesome," I said. "Is it not more likely that he crept out his window in the night to get into mischief and broke the latch in his hurry? He's 14 years old, is he not? About the right age to look for trouble? Or worse, have a schoolboy crush?" I sat beside her. "That must be it. He's mooning over a girl. He'll come wandering home once he realizes the hour." "But no one has seen him," said Mrs. Runkle. "I've asked up and down the waters." "And what girl in Dunham would admit to Earl as a suitor?" Mary scoffed. Jane released Mrs. Runkle's hand and smiled pleasantly. "I'm sure we'll find him on the road between here and Upper Watley, where some milkmaid has caught his fancy. He went to visit her and misjudged the time. Has anyone asked your Marvin?" Mrs. Runkle shook her head. "Marvin and Earl have not seen one another for almost a week, some misunderstanding between them. I don't know the nature of their quarrel, but Marvin will be of no help in this matter. Oh, Earl's mother will give her son such a thrashing if you're right. There's a party heading up into Dreadmore Heath, and another searching the fields and canyon west of Dunham. I don't know more. He left in such a hurry for your home as the men were organizing their searches." "Can we help in any way?" said Mary. "We can make sandwiches," said Mamma, and Mrs. Runkle seized upon this offer. Yes, gather supplies to feed the men as they come back. That would be much appreciated." "Of course," said Mamma, flapping her hands to scoot us away towards the kitchen. "Go on, ducklings, make provisions and take them to the village. Be as useful as you can. Harry, go and fetch your father and tell him he's been summoned." By this hour Papa was in the garden with his bees, and I found him repairing one of the skeps by the stone wall. He had a tuft of golden straw in one hand and an owl in the other, and the bees danced about his head with a merry buzzing. They never stung him, nor any of us. I thought very little about it, for I'd accepted that he was a kind beekeeper, and his wards treated him with fondness. But I suppose in a way his close friendship with the inhabitants of his apiary was a kind of quirk too. When he saw me coming, he held up one hand and hailed me. I returned his greeting and then said, "Earl Rabbit is missing. You've been asked by the mayor to join the search party." My father is a kindly man, but Earl's reputation preceded him, and Papa hunched his shoulders and set his tools aside with resignation. Oh, goodness. Wild creatures yesterday, wayward youths today, what will happen tomorrow? Dunham cannot handle so much excitement. "Earl has only slipped his mother's apron strings, I'm sure," I replied. "He probably thought he could find the snake himself." "Ah, a quest for glory, hey?" My father shook his head. "And his mother's in a state, no doubt. There'll be no bread for any of us until he's found, I suppose." My experience of the day before still played in my mind. You don't think he could be in any true danger, do you?" "Earl is not a very hardy lad, but I doubt he could be overtaken by a garter snake." Papa looked at me with a grin. "You don't believe Jane's nonsense that this serpent is an anaconda too, do you?" I considered my words. Any description of the massive, slithering beast in the forest would sound utterly ridiculous, and I regarded my father too highly to play the fool. He spoke to me as an equal, not a child, and I wouldn't want him to think that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. He might treat Jane's assumptions or Emma's dreamy fantasies with fawning affection, but he'd always been plain-spoken with Mary and me, and I wouldn't wish to jeopardize his good opinion. So instead I replied, "No, that seems outlandish. But there was a large animal in the trees, and the latch was broken on Earl's window. Mrs. Rabbit is sure he's been abducted, yet I can't think of anyone who would have an interest in the boy." and I've never heard of any reptiles opening locked windows to eat up young men. Papa chuckled at the thought. Nothing of great interest ever happens in Dunham County, Harry, and I'm sure today will not change that. Earl has gone a-wandering. This is nothing more than an excuse for the village to come together, hike through the fields, and enjoy a communal dinner afterwards. As we are all aware, Mayor Chowder loves an assembly. When Papa left for the village, I joined my sisters in the kitchen. However, the whole time we prepared food, Jane shot glances in my direction, and it wasn't until we were walking down the road with baskets of sandwiches, halfway to the village, and flanked on both sides by long pastures, that Jane was brave enough to speak. You think this must have something to do with yesterday's encounter. I can see it written plainly on your face. I'm wondering if we were incredibly fortunate, I replied. It didn't grab us, so it took Earl instead. But Harry, you said he'd gone on a jaunt to see a milkmaid. I did say that, yes, I replied to Emma, but I don't necessarily believe it. At that moment, a voice hailed us. We turned to see Frederick Darling galloping across the pastures on a fine grey steed. He wore a dark suit and a mustard-colored tie, and when he doffed his top hat to Jane, I noticed it had a yellow band to match. There was a radiance to him that matched the freshness of the morning sun, as if he was constructed specifically for the purpose of riding through dew-drenched meadows in the virginal light of day, and I found his perfection and precision distasteful, wondering to myself if his purity and excellent bearing had not been devised as a mockery of all natural processes. His chin was clean-shaven, not a single speck of mud marred his shoes, and such unearthly impeccability from head to toe rankled me like the dragging of fingernails over a chalk slate. "Ladies, good afternoon," he said, then startled at his own greeting. "Or, as it would seem, not good in the least. Auntie told me that you had an unfortunate encounter in the forest yesterday, and I feel personally responsible that I did not accompany you home and left you in such danger." "No one could have predicted it," said Jane. "Don't concern yourself further, Mr. Darling. Dunham is a safe and quiet place, and there's never been any cause for worry." "Please call me Frederick," he said. "I offer you profuse apologies, and assure you I'm happy you are well." With his gallant amends now made to Jane, he sat back and addressed us all. "You're on your way to help, I assume?" "We are," I said. "Where are the men searching?" "Every track and trail," came his reply. "George and Uncle have headed up to the heath, and I have taken the lowlands." "What about the vale below your uncle's house?" I said. "It has been thoroughly examined, Miss Harriet. Between last night and today, I don't think there's a single stone left unturned. A number of local boys searched the bushes last night. They've grown up here and know the hidden spots better than I ever could. I decided to stick to the open land, where I'd have a good view from the back of Uncle's horse." His mount sidestepped and tossed its grey head, straining to run. Jane reached out with one hand to stroke the animal's velvet nose, and it calmed under her touch. "Have you noticed anything strange?" "No," he said to me, "nothing out of the ordinary. Dunham is as perfect as a postcard." "Today I fear that perfection is only a veneer," Emma said. "The place is too quiet, too calm. There's not even the twittering of birds." Frederick nodded gravely. "Perhaps you're right, Miss Emma. As I told your sisters only yesterday, the heath was as quiet as the grave, and now it seems the rest of the countryside has fallen still too," he replied. "As for the character of the boy, did you know him well?" "No more or less than anyone," Emma said. "He could be a bit of trouble, especially with a slingshot in hand, but he rarely came as far as our cottage. He certainly never visited the library, nor sang in Mary's choir. There was little chance to cross paths except for visits to the bakery," I added. "If his absence is voluntary, I'm afraid we have no idea where he might have gone." "I doubt he left of his own volition," Frederick said. "Without coat or shoes? On a cool spring evening? No, he'd have to be a fool to leave those behind." It's true, Earl was no great philosopher, but even he would have seen the benefits of a jacket and boots on a damp night. "Then let us not keep you," said Jane, releasing the horse's head. "The boy is out there waiting for you to rescue him." Frederick cast her a sunny smile and put heels to flank, and the stallion shot off like a cannonball over the fields. We watched him disappear over a rise in the land. "Well," said Mary, "he's very earnest. He may be a bit of a blowhard, but he seems to have a good heart. It's a rare gentleman who would give of his time to search for a boy he does not know." "You're being too kind, Mary," said Jane. "Mr. Darling wishes to make a good impression on the village, and he could not do that by staying home, or even focusing his attention on the heath. Here in the lowlands is where he's most likely to encounter those whose good opinion he seeks," I said, crossing my arms. "No, Freddie is the more cunning brother, and knows a good opportunity to win favor when he sees it." "Oh, Perhaps you're being too harsh on Mr. Darling, said Mary with disapproval. Perhaps, I agreed, but I did not alter my sentiment. Our route took us past the schoolhouse and the mill yard and down to the waters, where the bridge arches over the steel-blue river like a lazy grey cat. Up the other side, the road took us into the heart of town and straight to the village hall. Here women gathered with their gifts of sustenance, brought in trade for gossip and news. Mrs. Cripplegate was there, and our cousin's new wife, Mrs. Bierce. In the corner stood Eunice, the Darlings' housemaid. Shock and horror suffused the very essence of the room. Sweet little Earl, they all said. At the far end of the hall sat Mrs. Rabbit, silent as stone. Mrs. Rabbit, I'm sorry, said Jane. Please, if there's anything we can do. But the poor woman, fidgeting with the hem of her flour-dusted apron, was too melancholy to speak. She was a sparse and skinny thing, and her misery added a greyness to her face that gave her the bearing of a wraith. The rotund Mrs. Chowder swanned from the crowd to shoo us away, leaving a fug of pungent perfume in her wake. As the mayor's wife, she had adopted the role of commander amongst the ladies, and they were happy to defer to her authority in times of trouble. Let Matilda Chowder take responsible for all decisions, if she relished the task. There was no detail too trifling to escape Mrs. Chowder's appraisal, and no item too grand that could not be improved by her opinion. Give her air, ladies, she said, wafting her hands about as if we were a cloud of flies. Can you not see the poor woman is in a fugue of despair? Our baskets caught her attention. Ah, more victuals for the men. Come, bring them over here. Set them out in a line just so. She gestured towards a long table, already groaning under the weight of casseroles and salads. Emma, Mary, and Jane followed Mrs. Chowder obediently, but I lingered behind, and when I returned to Mrs. Rabbit to sit next to her, I took her hand in mine. Mrs. Rabbit, I said softly. Her brown doe eyes rolled in their sockets to meet mine. Can you tell me what happened? She said nothing to me, yet through the warmth of her skin I perceived the rapid anxiety and drowning loss in her heart, and it prickled through my capillaries like ice water. She was beyond all verbalization. Her eyes filled with tears until her sorrow tumbled down her cheeks, and I felt in my soul the panic she'd experienced upon finding Earl's bed empty, and the window opened wide, the lock broken, and the bracing air wafting in from a world abnormally still. There'd been no hint of steps upon the dewy lawn, no broken twigs in the hedge, no footsteps to mar the dust of the road. No, Earl had been swooped away so fully, so completely, that the only trace of the boy to remain was the impression of his head upon his empty pillow. Then, for a singular heartbeat, I felt a flash of memories in her, a bright salvo of emotions flaring and dying in an instant. I bolted upright, eyes wide. The memories had been hidden as if behind a stone wall, but the wall fractured, and I experienced a sudden slash across my vision as bright and red as blood. As always, I felt as she felt, but suddenly I saw as she saw too, and the visions overwhelmed me. Clawing fingertips, a gust of wind amongst grey curtains, and most arresting of all, two fiery scarlet eyes surrounded by billowing black smoke. I dropped her hand in shock. She'd witnessed something, but the memory was gone. No, not just gone. Ripped out. What did you see, Mrs. Rabbit? I asked. The tear-streaked woman with an empty mind turned her face to stare at the wall. Miss Lovecraft, dear, leave her to her grief, Mrs. Chowder insisted. She's been struck dumb with emotion. It does no good for you to pester her. Mrs. Chowder grabbed me by the hand to pull me away from Mrs. Rabbit. I felt the sudden gush of sopping haughtiness, of pretensions, of looking down one's nose at all the lesser folk. The strength of it made me gag. I snatched back my hand. Has she said anything? I pressed. Could she even? I wondered. The missing memory was a raw, oozing wound across the center of her soul, leaving her psyche in shreds. The poor dear has said not a peep, was Mrs. Chowder's curt reply, and I doubt she will. That little rascal may have been a nuisance for most of us, but Earl was her oldest son and dearest to her. The mayor's wife clucked in her throat. Dr. Gelder has been summoned from Lower Watley. He'll be here by the turn of the hour. Was there blood in Earl's room? I said. What? Glory, no. There was nothing of the sort. Mrs. Chowder hushed and dropped her voice to hiss in my ear. Don't start a panic, Harriet. I've had enough trouble from you, squashing rumors of a giant snake hanging in the trees. There's been no violence done. But that merciless injury across Mrs. Rabbit's mind stabbed at me. There had been violence done, but of an invisible nature, and it had left Mrs. Rabbit with the will and intellect of a cabbage. I felt sick to my stomach, looking at her piteous figure, slowly rocking back and forth on her chair. The horrible discovery of her wound filled me with revulsion. How could anyone regard that slash of bright red, that splash of gore, the punch of emotional pain, and not come away reeling? I couldn't stay here a moment longer. The people, the sensations, the clamor, I needed quiet and solitude. I needed to hear myself think. Without bidding Mrs. Chowder goodbye, I hurried from the hall and went out into the world like a possessed hound, straight to the woods below Dreadmore Heath. A moment's hesitation overtook me as I drew into the forest, but I was too focused on my goal to feel much fear, and I entered that tunnel of verdant green with the sharp stab of Mrs. Rabbit's memory fresh in my mind. It drowned out any good sense or lingering doubts. The day was sunny and bright, very different from the moody gloom of yesterday's rainstorm, and the forest seemed much more friendly and welcoming. The puddles had evaporated into little circles of mud, and I strode along the track without impediment, heading directly for the overhanging branch where Jane and I had first caught sight of the serpent. Of course the beast was long gone, but I hoped the trees might share their information with me. It was as I stood there, looking up into the branches, that I heard my name cried out in the distance, and I turned to see Emma hurrying along the path, her basket swinging from the crook of her arm. "I saw you leave in a hurry," she said. "That Chowder woman," I muttered, and she nodded in understanding. "And here is the spot where you and Jane were so frightened," she said, looking up and one hand rooted in her basket. "There's nothing so dreadful today." She withdrew her camera obscura, that little caramel square with an unblinking eye, and held it gently in her two palms. "You've come to capture an image." "What good are my inventions if they can't help in some way?" she replied, her eyes still roving over the leaves and branches. "I shall fix this spot and time, and give us opportunity to return to it again and again for further study." I did not fully understand how Emma's camera obscura worked, but nor did I understand any of her curious inventions or their intended functions. She was prolific, but not precisely accomplished, and a machine was just as likely to provide an unforeseen function as the proposed one. For example, her attempt to create a miniature smelter had instead resulted in a lovely contraption for making toast. So I left her to her experimentation, and I veered to the right to explore the underbrush. Twigs caught at my stockings, ferns clutched at my shawl. I pushed through the greenery as one might wade through the shallows at the beach, and my eyes gazed upwards into the bowers, seeking any hint of the serpent that had dogged us. Moving from tree to tree, I touched each as I passed. Most of them kept their secrets, but my fingers grazed one alder and perceived a hint of life within, but also the trace of life without. A creature of immense vitality had lain in wait in the alder's branches. The sensation was old, easily overpowered by the exuberance of the tree's vital force. Whether the animal had been a cat or a squirrel or a creature of more mysterious origins, I couldn't tell. I examined the soft earth at the base of the tree, but there was no footprints, no scraps of hair, no spoor. Nothing. The forest lacked any trace of an animal's passage. The wind whispered through the upper canopy, but no mice scurried in the leaves, nor birds sang on the branches. The woods were utterly devoid of life. The air was still and deathly quiet. To my left, halfway up a small slope leading to the heath, I heard a flap. A flash of color moved amongst the green. I peered closer. There, amongst the brown bracken, a scrap of pink waved lazily in the breeze. My blood chilled. I was in no way prepared to find Earl's remains, and the adrenaline that flooded my veins turned my skin clammy. "Emma!" I called out. She hurried up the slope, and I heard her gasp as she spotted the misplaced color through the leaves. "Do you think—" I swallowed my apprehension and pushed through the bushes with my heart in my throat. Reluctant, yet unable to turn away, I swept my hands over the ferns and pushed them aside for a clear view. We both let out a rushing sigh of relief. Jane's umbrella, caught up in the brambles, had suffered a rip across its side, but such a tear could be easily mended. I plucked it up and closed it, and handed it to Emma. "Take it back to Jane and tell her that we've seen no evidence of anything in the trees. Whatever followed us is no longer here." "There's nothing here, Harry," she said. "Is it not strangely quiet? Where have all the birds gone?" She set a kiss on my cheek before heading off in the direction of town, and I watched her go, back down the road through the grove of maples. They bowed and swayed in the wind. I wondered for a moment if there might not be another movement there, too, of a body swinging high in the boughs. I listened for that moist squeak, that rustle of a reptilian body pushing through young leaves. But as the twigs shivered and rattled, I heard only the click of bare branches, high above my head. Was it lurking in the canopy, perfectly still? Was it watching me, even now? "Miss Lovecraft!" I half jumped out of my skin as a voice cried out from the top of the hill. Looking up the slope through the tangle of branches, I saw the elder Mr. Darling, along with a small retinue of young men, all dressed in hunting clothes and holding rifles at their hips. "Hello," he said, waving his hand over his head. I waved in reply. They waited as I climbed out of the steep ravine to meet them at the edge of open land. The heath of Dreadmoor spread out to the south. The humpy ground of gorse brush and heather tussocks looked brown and grey against the wide blue sky. Up here on the high plateau, the wind galloped unfettered for miles and miles, and it pulled at my skirts and threatened to rip the bonnet from my crown. If I looked behind me, I could see the valley and the forest, the silvery ribbon of river weaving through it all, the steeple of St. Dismas, and the squat buildings of Dunham village clustered together at the narrowest point of the waters. Past them were pastures, the road leading to the north, and in the far distance the hollow where my own cottage nestled. But looking southward, I saw nothing but a fierce and feral landscape, punctured here and there with ancient outcroppings of lichen-speckled boulders. "Good day, gentlemen," I said, then felt guilty for saying it, for as Frederick had recently pointed out, it was certainly no such thing. "Have you had any success?" "Not at all, miss," Mr. Darling replied, taking my hand to help me up the last few feet of the rocky incline. His touch ached with dismay and fatigue. "We've walked most of the trails across Dreadmoor Heath, and as I mentioned to you only yesterday, we've found them vacant of life." It had been the same in the vale. No whispers of rabbits in the grass, no squawks of magpies in the branches. "Not even a lizard," I said. "Not a one." "That's odd, is it not?" "Everything has fled," he said, as our group rambled along the edge of the heath in the direction of Dreadmoor Road, which cut across from the south. It was the only wagon track that crossed the heath to link our village to Upper Whatley. A figure was striding along the track towards us, and as Mr. Darling hailed him, I recognized the weathered face and battered derby hat of Mr. Tippler, the tinsmith. "Have you spotted any remains, Mitchell?" he called out. "Not a whit, neither man nor beastie," the man replied around his black pipe stem. "Where the dickens have they all gone?" Mr. Darling replied. "I don't think the beasties have died," Mr. Tippler continued. "I can find nary a trace of any flesh. Oh, mercy, I'm meaning the animals, not poor Earl. Nothing so gruesome as that." "We've found naught as well," Mr. Darling replied. "No life at all, either on the heath or in the woods. This is wicked indeed," said Mr. Tippler with another puff on his pipe. But I'd felt the tingle of a creature's passage in the wood, so I knew the land could not be completely empty. "Something must be out there," I mused, half to myself. "I heard about your snake, Miss Lovecraft," said Mr. Tippler. "I'm afraid I've seen no hint of it either." I heard gruff coughs from the men and looked to a few faces. The expressions were kind but clear. They had already dismissed our sighting as the fanciful visions of frightened women. "I did see something, gentlemen." "I believe you think you did," Mr. Darling replied, "but even a serpent leaves a trail." Mr. Tippler took a puff of his pipe and said in a cloud of smoke, "A snake's track looks like a rope dragged in the dust." Then he motioned towards the village. "But there weren't no tracks around the rabbit home, so unless a great eagle flew out of the sky to snatch Earl from his bed, I don't think this is the work of a humble beastie." He waggled his pipe to Mr. Darling. "The boy has run away, I tell you. He won't be back. The whole town will want to give him a pummeling for all the troubles he's caused." Some of the men grumbled. A day from work could hardly be spared, especially for a scoundrel like Earl. "Could a large animal be hiding in the forest on the top part of the river valley, to the west of the county?" I held fast to my hat as a fresh gust roared past. "There's the canyons, and plenty of caverns along the upper reaches of the river, and no one living up there for miles." "I doubt it," Mr. Tippler said with finality. He tipped his old hat back on his bald head and used his pipe stem to point across the heath. "There's no forest for the beastie to hide in, or gardens to browse, or chickens to steal. Only bare rock, miss, and I can't think of any creature that would want to spend its time there." Mr. Darling nodded in agreement. "The lads and I have been all the way along the tops of the cliff. If a creature was hiding in the woods, we'd have spotted broken vegetation on the boundaries, I'm certain." One of the younger men, Mr. Rufus Cripplegate, crossed his arms and shook his head in dismissal. With the sharpness of anger, he said, "I have a cow ready to drop her calf any moment now, and I can't be gallivanting." Hold on. I need a drink of water. This is a very long chapter. Okay. One of the younger men, Mr. Rufus Cripplegate, crossed his arms and shook his head in dismissal. With the sharpness of anger, he said, "I have a cow ready to drop her calf any moment now, and I can't be gallivanting all over the county looking for the lad. Damn foolish waste of time." "Has anyone checked the grounds of Northwich Hall?" I asked. A grumble of discontent rumbled through the men. "Bill Crumpsell and his son Teddy went out that way this morning," said Mr. Tippler, "but I don't know what good it'll do. The new owner has no fondness for meeting with the public." "Has anyone seen him yet?" I asked. "Not that I know," said Mr. Darling. "Perhaps Mr. Blackwood has seen something from his high tower, and does not even know the significance of it," I said. "Well," Mr. Tippler replied, "if he has, I doubt he'll own to it. Not very talkative." "A stranger in our midst, and a young boy missing? He'd best say something if he knows what's good for him," said a wiry fellow by the name of Gully, who was a year or two younger than Emma. There were nods of agreement and frustration. "Calm down, lads," said Mr. Darling. Then to me said, "Hurry on back to the village, Miss Lovecraft, and tell the ladies we'll return for lunch after we've walked the south bank of the river as far as the caverns. Go on now." As Mr. Tippler and the rest of the men filed away along the trail, Mr. Darling leaned close and added, "The boys are whipping themselves into a frenzy. It's better to keep them moving than to start speculating." I understood completely. But instead of heading back to the village, I turned my nose not north towards my home or east to the village, but northwest, through the copses of saplings that grew along the southern river bank, in the direction of the footbridge and the rambling woodlands and the sprawling gardens of Northwich Hall. I crossed paths with squat, red-headed Bill Crumpsell and barrel-bodied, bandy-legged Teddy at the river crossing, upstream from the village by a mile or so. Years ago, a massive fir tree had been planed and set out from bank to bank, and the log had made a serviceable bridge for walkers, but it was certainly not designed for the use of horse or carriage. By the time I reached the footbridge, Bill was halfway across, hand outstretched to steady himself. He was the butcher, and his arms were heavily muscled from years of carving meat and hacking bones, so much so that he appeared top-heavy as he stumbled across to shore. Teddy waited impatiently for his turn to cross. When I emerged from the copse of slender elms, Bill seemed surprised to see a woman strolling along the narrow path. "You shouldn't be out here," he warned from the far side of the river. "'Tis no safe place for a lady." "Nor for you, neither," I replied. "Who knows what dastardly creature has stolen poor Earl away? It may hunger for grown men next." "I'll be just fine, Miss Lovecraft," he said. He didn't like the slur against his strength and independence. A fellow takes great pride in his ability to conduct himself, and rarely thinks about his own safety, preferring instead to remind women of their delicacy and peril. "Hello, Miss Harriet," said Teddy from the far bank. "You look well today." "Thank you, Teddy," I replied. "Were you able to speak with Mr. Blackwood?" "We knocked, but he wouldn't answer." Bill hopped to my shore and added, "That fellow ain't friendly to visitors." "True," I replied as Teddy began crossing, and I waited until he joined us on the south shore to say, "I'm on my way home, Mr. Crumpsell, but I'll take a slight detour and drop by Northwich Hall. Perhaps my charm will work where yours has failed." Teddy gave a great galumphing laugh. "Will you say hello to Jane for me?" he asked. He'd always had a fondness for Jane, and tried very hard to attract her eye, but without much success. "I'll be happy to," I replied. "She's with my sisters at the village hall, though, and you can say hello yourself if you're quick back to town." If I'm not mistaken, a pink tinge crossed his freckled, nut-brown cheeks. Let Jane deal with Teddy at her heels, and give the young man a bit of hope. I continued on my way, and the grove of saplings yielded to a series of stone walls and muddy cowfields, eventually crossing a road and becoming Northwich land. I cut across the pastures to the driveway, up the gravel track between its flanking trees, and as I drew closer to the mansion, I was hardly surprised to see the cold chimneys and closed curtains. The upper windows were dark mirrors reflecting the brightly lit garden, and today the pond was perfectly placid, without even a giant trout to mar the surface. I stepped boldly up to the door. Had I not been here many times before? It had become perfectly normal, it seemed to me, and I rapped upon the wood. My boldness stemmed from the understanding that my earlier visits would be repeated, my knock would be ignored, and my presence rebuffed. Nothing had come from my previous call, and nothing would come from this one either. Oh, how wrong I was. So that was a really long chapter. Thank you very much for sticking it out with me. And I'll see you tomorrow for chapter 6.